When we talk about consistency, we're not talking about perfection, we're talking about repetition. Repetition of behaviors, thoughts, and physiological states that create long-term adaptation in the brain and body. Consistency isn't a personality trait, it's a skill. It can be trained, it must be trained, because everything that matters, everything with compounding value, demands consistency. From a neurobiological standpoint, the brain is designed to respond to patterns. It doesn't care if the pattern is good or bad. If it's repeated, it's reinforced. Neurons that fire together wire together. That's not a motivational quote, that's a biological law. So if you're doing something once or sporadically, your nervous system barely notices. But if you do it daily or at the same time every week, the brain starts adapting. It begins to anticipate, it prepares. This is how identity is formed, through consistent action that becomes internalized at a neural level. Now let's be very clear, forcing yourself to be consistent doesn't mean waking up every day feeling inspired or full of energy. That's a myth. It means training your mind and body to override emotion in favor of protocol. Protocols are powerful, they provide structure, and the brain loves structure, especially when it aligns with circadian biology, dopamine cycles, and deliberate focus. Let's start with a very basic principle. Behavior drives neurochemistry more reliably than the other way around. This means you don't wait to feel good to act. You act, and the action itself can trigger the internal state you're seeking. For example, getting sunlight in your eyes early in the day, especially in the first 60 minutes after waking, triggers a cascade of neurochemical changes: increased cortisol, which promotes alertness, increased dopamine, which enhances motivation, and eventual melatonin, released 12-16 hours later, which regulates sleep. If you're consistent with this habit, you entrain your circadian rhythm, you start to sleep better, focus better, and perform better across the board, but it only works if you do it daily. Not once, not when it's convenient, daily. This is just one instance. The same principle applies to movement, to work, to learning, to relationships. If you want to get better at anything, you need to do it consistently. And that's where the idea of forcing yourself comes in, because we're not always going to want to do the thing, we're not always going to feel like it. In fact, the brain is designed to conserve energy. It doesn't want you to exert more than necessary, so the default setting is resistance. You have to override that. That override is effort, but effort itself is neurochemically rewarded, especially when it's voluntary and purposeful. Dopamine is key here. It's the molecule of motivation, but also of pursuit and reward. Most people misunderstand dopamine. They think it's about pleasure. It's not. It's about anticipation. When you set a goal and take action toward it, especially consistent action, your brain releases dopamine, not at the finish line, but during the pursuit. The problem is that if you only chase high intensity rewards, scrolling, binging, novelty, you deplete your dopamine system. You become less motivated over time. But if you reward yourself for low-intensity, high-value actions, like showing up, doing the reps, sticking to the schedule, your baseline dopamine improves, and with a higher baseline, you become more resilient. You're less dependent on spikes. That's how you build discipline. You can train this system. You can condition yourself to crave the process instead of just the outcome. It starts with micro-consistency. Small, repeatable behaviors done at specific times, anchored to existing routines. This is called habit stacking. For example, if you already brush your teeth every morning, you can anchor a cold shower or a brief mobility routine to that. Over time, the behavior becomes automatic, and it requires less cognitive load to initiate. This reduces friction, which is often the main barrier to consistency. But let's be honest, friction isn't just about time or logistics. It's about internal resistance, self-doubt, perfectionism, fear of failure. These are neural patterns too, and the only way to weaken them is to act in spite of them. That's the forcing function. You don't wait for fear to go away. You do the thing anyway, and every time you do, you're rewiring your brain. You're teaching it that action is safe, that discomfort is tolerable, that you are in control, and with each repetition, the fear loses power. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change, is not reserved for children or young adults. It's available throughout life, but it has rules. One of those rules is intensity plus repetition equals change. This means that if you engage with something actively, with focus and emotional engagement, and you repeat it consistently, the brain will adapt. This is true whether you're learning a skill, breaking a habit, or building a new one. But you must show up repeatedly, even when it's boring, especially when it's boring, because boredom is a sign that your brain isn't being overstimulated, and that's a good thing. That's where depth is built. Let's talk about identity for a moment. People often say, "I'm not the kind of person who's consistent," or "I always fall off." That's not identity. That's habit history, and it can change. Every time you follow through on a commitment, even a small one, you cast a vote for the person you want to become. Identity is built through behavior, not the other way around. So if you want to see yourself as someone who's consistent, start acting like it. Even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it, because those are the moments that matter most. Those are the moments that create self-trust. Self-trust is a neurobiological state. It's built through congruence, when your actions align with your intentions. When you say you're going to do something and you actually do it, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain involved in planning and decision-making, sends a clear signal: we follow through. That signal is reinforced over time. The more often you follow through, the stronger the signal becomes, and eventually it becomes automatic, not because you're special, because you trained it. Let's also not overlook the role of the autonomic nervous system. This system regulates your stress response, your ability to stay calm, focused, and engaged under pressure. If your nervous system is dysregulated, if you're constantly in fight or flight mode, it becomes much harder to stay consistent. So part of the equation is learning how to regulate. Tools like breathwork, cold exposure, and deliberate decompression can help. These practices shift your physiology. They allow you to enter parasympathetic states more easily, which improves recovery, focus, and emotional regulation. And again, they only work if done consistently. Now, many people ask, what if I miss a day? The answer is simple: start again. One miss isn't failure. 2 in a row is a pattern. So if you fall off, the only priority is to re-engage. The brain respects that. It recognizes effort, and more importantly, it recognizes pattern. So don't aim for perfect. Aim for consistent recovery. That's the real power, not never failing, but always returning. Let's also address the myth of motivation. Motivation is unreliable. It's a state, not a trait. It comes and goes, and it's heavily influenced by sleep, nutrition, hormones, and external stimuli. What you need is systems. Systems don't rely on mood. Systems are made of triggers, routines, and rewards. They're repeatable, measurable, and adjustable. You design them around your energy cycles, your environment, and your goals. And once they're in place, you just execute day after day. You don't negotiate, you don't debate, you just run the protocol. And that's what forcing yourself to be consistent really means. It means becoming the kind of person who doesn't make every action subject to feeling, who doesn't need the stars to align, who doesn't need external validation, just internal clarity. And that clarity comes from repetition, from doing the work whether or not it feels good. Because you understand that the compound interest of consistency is more valuable than the short-term comfort of avoidance. This is not about grinding yourself into burnout. This is not about toxic productivity. It's about aligning your behavior with your biology and your goals. It's about understanding how the brain learns, how the body adapts, and how identity is forged, and then using that knowledge to your advantage. You don't need more information. You need more execution. You don't need more inspiration. You need more repetition. So the question is not, how do I stay consistent? The question is, what structure will I build to make consistency the default? The answer lies in protocols. Morning routines, sleep hygiene, physical training, deep work windows, digital boundaries. These are not hacks, they're anchors. Anchors that stabilize your behavior in a world full of noise and distraction. When you force yourself to be consistent, you're not suppressing who you are, you're revealing who you could be, you're activating systems within you that have been dormant, you're reclaiming agency from randomness, and you're building something far more powerful than intensity, sustainability. And it's important to know this neurobiologically. Change feels uncomfortable because you're literally rewiring your brain. That's not a flaw, that's adaptation. Lean into that. Let the discomfort be a signal that something meaningful is happening, And when the impulse arises to stop, to skip, to delay, observe it, acknowledge it, and choose action anyway. That is the neural rep. That is the moment that builds resilience. That is what compounds. So whatever it is you're trying to do, whether it's waking up early, learning a skill, writing a book, starting a business, meditating, training, do it with intention. Do it with repetition, and do it with respect for the biology that governs behavior, because when you force yourself to be consistent, you're not just building habits, you're building a system that doesn't depend on luck, or mood, or willpower. A system that's rooted in science, refined by action, and capable of changing your life from the inside out. And while the term force may sound aggressive or even unsustainable to some, it's important to redefine it not as brute pressure, but as intentional redirection of neural energy. Every time you force yourself to do the thing you said you'd do, especially when it's inconvenient, you're redirecting resources in the brain, from areas associated with distraction and avoidance to those involved in execution and goal pursuit. This is not about bullying yourself into productivity. It's about using your biology to train self-regulation, which is the cornerstone of consistency. One of the key players in this is the anterior cingulate cortex. This region is heavily involved in error detection and performance monitoring. It tracks the gap between what you intended to do and what you're actually doing. When you decide to skip a workout, procrastinate on a task, or reach for your phone instead of your journal, this part of the brain lights up. It's letting you know there's a mismatch. Most people feel this as guilt or anxiety. But instead of avoiding that signal, you can use it as a trigger for correction. That moment of friction can become a moment of alignment. If you act on it, if you get back on track, you reduce the internal tension and the system resets. This is not a one-time correction. It's a skill that gets better with repetition, and over time you become more attuned to the micro signals of misalignment. You start to catch yourself earlier, you intervene faster. And eventually, you don't even need the same level of effort. The system starts running on its own because that's how the brain works. It craves predictability, it rewards consistency, and it punishes randomness, at least when it comes to goal-oriented behavior. Let's also look at the power of visualizing consistency, not as a passive daydream, but as an active neural rehearsal. Mental rehearsal activates many of the same neural circuits as actual behavior. If you visualize yourself sticking to a habit, going through the motions, resisting the urge to quit, and completing the routine, your brain begins to perceive it as more familiar. This reduces the energy cost of initiation. You're essentially priming your nervous system to act, and when that visualization is paired with physiological signals of readiness, like elevated adrenaline or focused breathing, it becomes even more effective. You can literally train your brain to make consistency feel more natural, but consistency doesn't mean rigidity. There's a difference. Rigidity resists feedback. Consistency integrates it. When you're forcing yourself to be consistent, you're not ignoring signals of fatigue or stress. You're learning to discern them. Are you tired because your nervous system is overwhelmed, or because your mind is seeking novelty? Are you bored because the task is too easy, or because it's meaningful but requires depth? These questions matter. They allow you to adjust your protocol, not abandon it. They help you refine the system so it serves you long term, not just in bursts. There's a very important principle here, flexibility within consistency. That means your anchor points remain fixed, such as daily training, writing, or reflection, but the method may shift. One day your workout might be strength focused, the next it could be mobility. One day your journaling might involve gratitude, the next it's problem solving. The time block stays consistent, the ritual stays intact, but the content evolves. This keeps the brain engaged without losing the power of routine. It also aligns with how the brain encodes memory and motivation, by recognizing both novelty and familiarity in tandem. Sleep also plays a fundamental role in consistency. It's not just about getting more sleep, it's about consistent sleep. Going to bed and waking up at the same time every day anchors your circadian rhythm. That rhythm regulates everything from mood to hormone release to attention span. If you're inconsistent with sleep, your ability to be consistent in other areas plummets. And what's often overlooked is that forcing yourself to maintain a sleep schedule is one of the most potent ways to increase discipline. It's not glamorous, it's not celebrated, but it's foundational. Because if your brain and body are out of sync, no amount of willpower will compensate. You'll be fighting uphill every single day, and then there's nutrition. It's easy to think of food purely in terms of calories, but that's short-sighted. Food is neurochemical input. The types of foods you eat, and when you eat them, influence your ability to focus, to recover, and to regulate emotion. Stable blood sugar, adequate amino acids, and proper micronutrient intake all contribute to the neurochemical environment that supports habit formation. If you're skipping meals, eating erratically, or relying on ultra-processed inputs, your ability to be consistent will be compromised, not because of character, but because of chemistry. This is why forcing yourself to eat at regular times or to prepare nutrient-dense meals isn't just about physical health, it's about training reliability at the behavioral level. Every consistent meal is a vote for your future cognitive capacity. Every time you say no to a dopamine spiking junk food choice and yes to something your brain actually needs, you strengthen the neural circuits that delay gratification. And those same circuits will help you say no to skipping a session, ignoring a task, or giving in to distraction. Now let's address perhaps the most pervasive challenge to consistency, the modern digital environment. You are living in a landscape engineered for inconsistency. Every notification, every infinite scroll, every swipe is a rupture in your attention. And attention is the currency of consistency. If your attention is fractured, your efforts will be too. So forcing yourself to be consistent in this age means intentionally building barriers. It means using tools like scheduled phone, free time, website blockers, deep work rituals, and environmental cues to preserve focus. Focus is not just a cognitive skill, it's a metabolic event. It costs glucose. It costs neurotransmitter resources. And the more often you switch tasks or allow digital inputs to interrupt your thought process, the more expensive consistency becomes. This is why people feel mentally exhausted by midday, even though they haven't done anything physically taxing. Their attention has been drained by fragmentation. The solution is not to try harder, it's to simplify, reduce the number of open loops, create clear start and stop signals for each session, honor your own boundaries as if they were non-negotiable appointments. Because in a very real way, they are. The people who appear most disciplined are often the ones with the fewest unnecessary decisions. They don't rely on willpower moment to moment. They rely on systems and constraints. They design their environment to reward consistency. That's something anyone can do, and it starts with simple decisions, like laying out your clothes the night before, scheduling your creative work during peak energy windows, or planning meals in advance. These are not signs of obsession. They are signs of self-respect. They're the infrastructure of consistency. There's another factor that's critical here: social accountability. The brain is a social organ. It tracks status, approval, and alignment with group norms. If you're surrounded by people who are inconsistent, distracted, or ambivalent, your nervous system will start to mirror that. But if you're surrounded, even digitally, by people who show up, who do the work, who live by systems and not emotions, your own standards rise, you begin to adopt their patterns. This isn't about comparison. It's about co-regulation. Humans learn through modeling, and consistency, like effort, is contagious. So one way to force yourself to be consistent is to engineer exposure to consistent people. Follow creators who live by principles. Join communities where daily execution is the norm. Share your goals with those who understand structure, not just passion. Let their behavior become part of your neural network. Let their repetition shape your own. Because when consistency becomes part of your culture, not just your calendar, everything changes. And this leads to perhaps the most powerful lever of all identity-based consistency. When your behaviors are no longer about checking boxes, but about expressing who you are, they become deeply embedded. You no longer say, "I have to work out today." You say, "I'm someone who trains no matter what." You don't say, "I should write." You say, "I'm a writer and writers write." That shift from behavior to identity, locks in consistency at the core level, and it's not aspirational, it's trainable. You can become the kind of person who is consistent by acting like that person every day. Of course, you'll miss some days, of course, you'll slip. That's not a crisis, that's data. Use it, track it, adjust, return, because the ultimate test of consistency isn't perfection, it's recovery speed. How fast do you get back up? How quickly do you reconnect with your system? That's what determines longevity. That's what compounds, not the best day, but the average day, not the intensity, but the fidelity. How true are you to your own design? Forcing yourself to be consistent is not about ignoring how you feel. It's about using how you feel as input, not as the driver. It's about creating distance between stimulus and response, between emotion and action, and that distance is where your power lies. Every time you choose to act in alignment with your protocol despite discomfort, you widen that gap, you reinforce the executive functions of the brain. You increase the space between impulse and integrity. That is where consistency is born, and over time, what once felt forced becomes fluid. What once took energy becomes effortless, not because the work is easier, but because you're stronger. Because your system is more robust, because your identity is more aligned. You don't just force consistency, you become it. It's not what you do, it's who you are, not every hour, but over time. Not every decision, but on average. And that average, that slope, is what defines your life. And as you continue reinforcing these behaviors, what you're actually doing is establishing neural real estate, allocating physical, chemical, and electrical resources within your brain to support the consistent execution of specific routines. Each time you act in alignment with your intended behavior, you're reinforcing synaptic connections within the prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia. These areas are responsible for planning and habit formation, respectively. And when they communicate efficiently, it allows the brain to offload certain behaviors from conscious effort into automatic processes. That's the essence of what we mean when we say a habit has become second nature. It literally requires less conscious attention, less metabolic cost, and less deliberation because the circuit has been optimized through repeated, consistent use. And yet, this transition from effortful action to effortless behavior does not happen by accident. It happens by deliberate, focused repetition, which means you must be prepared to override your default state over and over again, especially in the beginning. The default state of the human brain is not discipline. It is energy conservation. From an evolutionary standpoint, your brain was designed to preserve calories, avoid unnecessary risks, and maximize comfort. But in the modern world, these ancient mechanisms often backfire. Because today, comfort is abundant and risk is low, which means your default state is more likely to lead to stagnation than survival. Forcing consistency means recognizing this mismatch and designing your daily structure to counteract it. This is where protocols matter. A protocol is not a vague intention. It's a specific, time-bound, behaviorally clear set of actions that remove ambiguity. Ambiguity is the enemy of consistency. When you leave too much room for interpretation, when you say, "I'll work out sometime tomorrow," or "I'll eat healthy this week," you open the door for negotiation, and negotiation, especially under emotional or cognitive fatigue, often leads to failure. So instead, you build micro environments and time blocks that eliminate choice. You use calendars, visual cues, physical barriers, and task bundling to create a closed-loop system. You're no longer making dozens of micro decisions throughout the day. You're executing pre-decided routines. This frees up bandwidth for creativity, presence, and problem solving while preserving the foundation of consistent action. One way to think about this is through the lens of state-dependent memory. Your brain encodes and retrieves information based on the physiological and environmental state you're in. If you always write in the same chair, at the same time, after the same trigger, like a cup of tea or a breathing protocol, your brain begins to associate that state with writing. Over time, just entering that state primes the neural pathways needed for the task. This makes initiation easier, it reduces friction, and the easier it is to start, the more likely you are to sustain. Forcing consistency in this context doesn't mean applying brute force every day. It means applying intelligent, repeatable systems that reduce the need for motivation. And let's talk about motivation. Most people wait for motivation to act. That's backwards. Motivation is not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct. It comes from evidence. When you force yourself to be consistent, even in small ways, you build internal evidence that you can trust yourself. That trust creates momentum. That momentum creates meaning. And that meaning produces the neurochemical signature of motivation: increased dopamine, increased norepinephrine, and heightened engagement with your task. So the real question is not how do I stay motivated, it's how do I act in the absence of it. That's the skill, that's the training. You are conditioning yourself to act not because you feel like it, but because the act itself aligns with who you are becoming. Let's bring in the concept of effort-based rewards. When you engage in difficult tasks, particularly those that require sustained attention, delayed gratification, and physical or mental strain, you activate neural pathways involving the mesolimbic dopamine system. But what's critical is how the reward is framed. If the reward is external, a prize, a compliment, a number on a scale, then the brain becomes dependent on that outcome. But if the reward is internalized, if the process itself becomes rewarding because it reinforces your identity, then the dopamine system adapts accordingly. You start to find satisfaction in the effort itself. And this is one of the most powerful shifts in human behavior, when the strain of the effort becomes meaningful, even pleasurable, not because it's easy, but because it signals to your brain, I'm doing the work, I'm living in alignment, and the only way to reach that point is by repetition. Consistent, deliberate repetition of actions that initially feel hard, unfamiliar, or unrewarding. You are training your neurochemistry to respond to process, not just outcomes. This is what long-term success is built on. Not just talent, not just vision, but process-oriented dopamine signaling. You don't just want the result. You learn to want the path that gets you there, and that only happens by doing it again and again, often in the absence of external validation, applause, or excitement. It's also worth noting the role of micro-failures in reinforcing consistency. You will fail, you will miss workouts, you will get distracted, you will overeat or oversleep or underperform. That's not an exception. It's part of the protocol. But what separates those who maintain consistency from those who collapse is the ability to treat failure as feedback. Every missed rep, every skipped session, every relapse is a data point. If you collect and review that data without self-judgment, you can iterate on your systems. You can identify where the protocol broke down. Was it the timing, the emotional trigger, the environment? Once you isolate the weak link, you can reinforce it. That's adaptation. That's neural resilience. And that mindset, the ability to turn friction into refinement, is the very essence of sustainable consistency. One highly effective tool for reinforcing this is self-tracking, not as a form of control or punishment, but as a source of self-awareness. When you track your behaviors, your sleep, your movement, your nutrition, your focus, you are literally training your prefrontal cortex to care about patterns, and the brain loves patterns. It thrives on them. By reviewing your data regularly, not obsessively but objectively, you start to see trends. You begin to understand what days go well and why, what triggers inconsistency, and how to intervene early. It's like having a mirror for your behavior. And over time, that mirror becomes a map. And let's not forget the importance of recovery. Consistency does not mean intensity at all times. It means showing up with integrity, including when showing up means resting. The nervous system is a finite resource. It needs cyclic restoration. Sleep, sunlight, breath work, none. Sleep, deep rest, NSDR, and periods of intentional solitude. All of these help replenish the neurochemical substrates that fuel action. If you push without recovery, you don't build consistency. You build fragility. You're burning through dopamine, draining serotonin, and overtaxing the adrenal system. So part of forcing yourself to be consistent is forcing yourself to recover with the same precision you apply to performance. Rest is not passive, it's preparatory, and over time, the rituals of consistency begin to integrate. What was once a series of isolated habits becomes a cohesive system. Your morning routine prepares your mind. Your training protocol energizes your physiology, your nutritional rhythm stabilizes your mood, your evening wind down cues deep sleep, and all of it is connected. This is how you transition from a reactive, inconsistent lifestyle to a proactive, coherent one. Not by chance, by design, by micro, decisions made daily and reinforced hourly. And when you build this lifestyle, what emerges is a profound sense of agency. You are no longer at the mercy of mood, circumstance, or chaos. You don't need a perfect day to do your work. You don't need perfect conditions to show up. You have trained yourself to operate under friction. You have built a nervous system that can tolerate discomfort and still function at a high level. That is rare, that is powerful, that is transferable to every domain of life, from relationships to business to health, and it begins with the decision to be consistent when it's least convenient. Because ultimately, this isn't just about behavior. It's about belief. Every time you act in alignment with your protocol, you're telling your brain, this is who I am, and that identity, once earned, becomes the compass for your actions. It removes decision fatigue. It creates behavioral momentum, and it makes it easier to endure setbacks because you're no longer fighting for a goal. You're living from a standard that's been earned through repeated, consistent, deliberate action. You didn't hope for it, you didn't wait for it, you forged it, you forced it, and now it's yours. And as that identity becomes more deeply ingrained, the friction you once felt begins to transform into flow. The actions that required intense effort become familiar territory. You've taught your nervous system how to handle stress, how to push through resistance, how to maintain behavioral integrity even when your emotional state says otherwise. This is what neuroscientists call top-down regulation, the process by which higher-order brain functions, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, modulate lower-order impulses from the limbic system. In simple terms, your rational goal-directed self trains the more primitive, reactive self to wait, to pause, to follow the system, not the sensation. That's not just mental strength, that's neuroplasticity at work. The reward system doesn't get hijacked anymore. You don't chase the short-term dopamine spike. You've recalibrated what your brain finds pleasurable. Instead of craving comfort, you crave growth. Instead of escaping discomfort, you begin to associate it with progress. Not because the discomfort feels good in and of itself, but because it serves a purpose. It signals effort, and you've trained your reward circuitry to honor effort. That's a radical shift in neural programming. It's not something you're born with. It's built rep by rep, routine by routine. Now let's consider what happens when you're faced with disruption, a life event, an injury, a loss, something that breaks your rhythm. This is where most people lose their footing. Their protocol collapses because it was built on the assumption of control. But the real test of consistency isn't how well you perform when everything's ideal. It's how quickly you can recalibrate when things fall apart. If your nervous system is resilient, if your habits are modular, if your internal framework is stronger than external chaos, you can adapt without losing your momentum. Maybe you shorten your routine. Maybe you substitute one habit for another, but the thread remains. You stay tethered to your identity through action, even if that action looks different temporarily, and in those moments, self-compassion becomes a tool, not a loophole. It's not an excuse to give up, it's a framework to recalibrate without shame. Because shame is neurologically corrosive. It shuts down the prefrontal cortex, activates the threat response, and often drives people further from their routines. But when you treat lapses as part of the process, not the end of it, you maintain psychological flexibility, and psychological flexibility, combined with behavioral consistency, is the formula for long-term mastery in any domain. There's a biochemical basis for this, too. When you remain consistent in behavior despite fluctuations in mood or environment, you maintain a stable pattern of dopamine release, not spikes, not crashes, stability. That matters because dopamine isn't just about pleasure. It's about motivation, drive, and forward momentum. When your dopamine system becomes dysregulated through over-reliance on rewards, social media, stimulants, or erratic schedules, it becomes harder to initiate behavior. You procrastinate, you avoid, you spiral, but with consistent goal-aligned behavior, you maintain what's known as tonic dopamine levels. That's the background signal that keeps you engaged without burnout. It's the chemical signature of sustainability, and sustainability is the real currency here. Anyone can sprint for a week. Anyone can be motivated when the vision is fresh, when the energy is high, when people are watching. But real progress, the kind that rewires your brain, reshapes your body, transforms your life, that kind of progress only responds to one thing: consistency under pressure, consistency when no one's watching. Consistency when the outcome is still uncertain. That's when you build the internal circuitry that says, this is who I am, no matter what's happening around me. And that circuitry is built in the margins, those tiny windows of choice throughout the day when you either align with your system or deviate from it. It's the choice to begin your protocol when you're tired, to finish what you started when distractions rise, to return to your breath, your calendar, your commitments when your mind wants to wander. And the good news is, the more you make those micro choices in alignment, the easier they become. Because you're no longer relying on willpower, you're relying on structure, and structure outperforms emotion every time. What we know from both neuroscience and behavioral science is that structure doesn't limit freedom, it enables it. When your schedule, your environment, and your rituals are optimized for consistency, you gain back massive amounts of cognitive energy. You don't have to think about what to do next. You don't have to debate every decision. You simply execute. That's not robotic. That's elite performance. That's how world-class operators in every field, from athletes to creatives to scientists, stay locked in. They simplify the decision-making process by narrowing the options. Not because they're inflexible, but because they're clear, and clarity is another byproduct of consistency. The more you follow your protocols, the more you learn about yourself. What conditions help you thrive? What time of day is your mind most sharp? What nutritional patterns support energy? What social environments drain or fuel you? You don't have to guess. You're collecting real data, and that data informs refinements. Your systems evolve, your protocols become more elegant, less friction, more flow, more alignment between what you want and what you do, and in that alignment something powerful emerges: integrity, not moral integrity, though that may be part of it, but behavioral integrity. The sense that your actions consistently reflect your values, that you're not betraying yourself for convenience, that your word to yourself holds weight. Most people don't realize how much inner conflict comes from self-betrayal. Saying you'll get up early and hitting snooze, saying you'll eat clean and grabbing junk food, these small inconsistencies chip away at your confidence, not because of the action itself, but because of the signal it sends: I don't trust myself. But when you start stacking days where your actions and intentions match, you build a different identity, one that says, I can rely on me. That kind of identity is self-reinforcing. It fuels more consistent action. You no longer need external accountability to move. You move because movement is what you do. You work, train, reflect, recover, not as acts of effort, but as expressions of identity. And this feedback loop, action leading to identity leading to more action, is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. It's not motivation, it's not discipline, it's congruence, and congruence sustains you through everything. You might wonder how this applies to highly creative or unstructured pursuits. Isn't spontaneity important? Isn't flexibility essential? Absolutely. But here's the paradox: the more structured your foundation, the more creative freedom you unlock. When your energy, focus, and time are no longer consumed by basic survival habits, when you know your mind and body are in sync, you can explore, create, improvise with far greater range. Jazz musicians practice scales until they're automatic. Painters master technique before abstraction. Writers build routines so the muse has a place to land. Spontaneity isn't the absence of structure. It's what happens when structure becomes so well integrated that it disappears from conscious thought. That kind of automaticity is earned, and it's fragile. It needs maintenance. That's why even after habits are formed, the work doesn't stop. You have to audit your systems, tweak the variables, recommit every week. Consistency is not a one-time decision. It's a daily calibration. You adjust to seasons, to cycles, to stress, but you never walk away from the system entirely, because when you do, the regression is faster than you think. Habits decay, neural pathways prune, attention fragments, and what was once effortless becomes hard again. So part of forcing consistency is being vigilant, respecting the protocols that got you here even when you feel like you've outgrown them. And this level of self-respect, the discipline to do what works even when you're tempted to improvise, isn't rigidness, it's maturity, it's the willingness to acknowledge that success doesn't come from how you feel. It comes from what you do consistently across contexts, through friction, around obstacles, and despite emotion. That kind of internal stability is what makes people powerful, not loudness, not status. Not intensity, but steadiness, a regulated nervous system, a repeatable rhythm, a brain that knows what to expect each morning, and a body that follows through. That's not to say every day will look the same. Life will still surprise you, but when your internal world is calibrated, the external noise has less power. You can shift course without losing direction. You can get knocked down without losing the thread. Because your anchor isn't outside, it's built into your system. It's your breath, your body, your behavior. You've trained yourself to show up, and that training is what carries you through the inevitable storms of life, the high pressure moments, the fatigue, the doubt. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall back on your consistency, and this is how greatness is built, quietly, repeatedly, in small actions, early mornings, intentional decisions, disciplined evenings. Not with fanfare, not with flashes of inspiration, but with a protocol you've chosen to respect every day, regardless of how you feel. You've stopped negotiating with yourself. You've stopped asking, do I want to do this? You simply do it. Because you've decided that the future you want is worth more than the comfort of the moment. And that decision, once made consistently, changes everything. So here's the bottom line. Consistency isn't glamorous, but it's the foundation of everything meaningful. If you want to master your craft, strengthen your body, sharpen your mind, deepen your relationships, whatever it is, you have to earn it through repeated, deliberate action. There is no shortcut, no hack, no emotional loophole that can replace showing up every day. It's not about intensity, it's about endurance, not about hype, but about habits. The brain thrives on repetition, the body responds to rhythm, and identity is forged through what you do repeatedly, not what you say you'll do. Force yourself to be consistent, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary, because nothing changes until you do. And once consistency becomes part of who you are, there's almost nothing you can't build, overcome, or become.